Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, and you're very welcome to another Signpost Series webinar. I hope you're all keeping well and looking forward to another very interesting presentation. Continuing on from last week, we enjoyed a really interesting presentation from Professor John Feehan's keynote address from the Extensive Grassland Biodiversity Event recently hosted by Teagasc and the Heritage Council in Birr. And in part two this week, we're doing things a little bit different again, but I hope you enjoyed last week and we'll have more of the same this week. And we're going to look back at a recording firstly of a presentation given by John Muldowney from the Department of Agriculture on the day of the event covering engagement and extensive grasslands under acres. Following this, we're going to have a presentation from Professor Helen Sheridan of UCD, who joins us to discuss the types and management of extensive grassland. And we're delighted to be joined this morning by UCD's Professor Helen Sheridan and Pat Morrisson from the Department of Agriculture. Good morning, Helen. Good morning, Pat.
Good morning, Cathal. Many thanks for having us here.
No, I'm great to come along. Where are you based today, Helen?
I'm in Belfield in the School of Agriculture and Food Science in Belfield, Cathal.
Lovely. And Pat, how about yourself?
Yeah, I'm my home in Clonmel, County Tipperary, so
super. And you're here to help us out with any questions that might arise from John's presentation. So thanks a million for that, Pat, as well. And we're also joined by Teagasc Countryside Management Specialist, Dr. Keena. How are you, Catherine?
Hi, hello, everybody.
Yeah, and Catherine, you're going to help out with questions or anything difficult that arises this morning. We're going to direct it towards you anyway. and Catherine, before we kick off, maybe I know we spoke about the launch of a book there last week, but maybe you give us a rundown about the book again.
Yeah, I suppose the event in Birr was the launch of a splendid book. Teagasc published this book back in 2012. It's a book by John Feehan, our own Helen here beside us, and Damien Egan. So it's on the grasses of Ireland, and it went down a treat then. And but in recent times, I think it's more relevant than ever now with the changing emphasis on biodiversity and on extensive grassland. So there's been a lot of demand for it. So with the help of the Heritage Council this time, the Teagasc reprinted the book. It is available from Teagasc in Oak Park for €35. I will put the phone number in the chat, but it's Teagasc, Oak Park, and ask for the Grasses book for €35. So yeah, thanks, Cathal.
Yeah. So with that, I'm going to ask Yvonne might share a video to kick off. And this is the video that John Muldowney presented on the day of the event in Birr. He's from the Department of Agriculture, and it's covering engagement and extents of extensive grasslands under acres. And following that, then we'll have a presentation from Helen.
My name is John Muldowney, and I work within the Department of Agriculture in the Agriculture and Environmental Structures Division. So the role I have is basically, I suppose, trying to assist the policy development and the rollout of operations in relation to agri-environment in Ireland. Also within my role, I have the structures, farm structures, so the TAM scheme, and again, it's the rollout of that and the delivery of inspections at farm level. So I guess, John set out the context of the importance of grassland, and again, the passion of why we should be looking after those. And I suppose what we're doing in agri-environmental policy, this is the acre scheme, and it's really where boots hit the ground. It's that close contact sport of trying to engage with farmers and to try and impart on them the passion of why we need to be looking after grasslands. So I suppose I'll try and take you through, the road or the path that we've passed over the last 20 odd years, I guess, in terms of development of agri-environment. So currently, the acre scheme is our flagship agri-environmental scheme. There's a budget of 1.5 billion over the period 2023 to 2027. So it's a huge budget in terms of what's rolled out. And that's on top of probably in excess of 6 billion that's been spent on agri-environment since 1994. So this is a long road. It's been evolving all the way along, and I'll come on to that. But basically at the moment, the coloured areas you see here are these high priority zones. Within these zones are primarily designated land, either for Natura, Habitats Directive, Birds Directive, High Status Water Framework Directive. They're the key areas in the country in terms of trying to protect and restore, and that's where we've focused our results-based payments in those areas. The rest of the country then just has a standard prescription-based scheme. So in terms of the evolution, REP started out back in 1994. And I guess it was a very successful scheme of its time. It had up to 70,000 participants at one point. But since then, the scheme has evolved from REPs, which was basically a flat rate payment to farmers for agri-environment, through AOS, which was a sort of an action-based approach, but farmers were trying to select, I suppose, the actions that paid highest, maybe weren't the most optimum for the area. And since then, we've been taking learnings from the EIP, these locally led operational groups like the Hen Harrier Project, the Freshwater Pearl Mussel, the Burn Scheme, and trying to incorporate them into what we have now in terms of acres. So it's trying to basically target the right action in the right place and to try and optimize then results-based payments. So a quality-based payment, the same way as we have a grading system for livestock being sold to the factory, this is trying to put a value on higher value, higher quality habitats get higher payments relative to lower quality ones. The structure of acres, there's a core payment for results-based payments, and then on top of that we have these non-productive investments and landscape actions, which are effectively our complementary actions that help address any threats and pressures that the scorecard identifies in the scoring of your land. That could be around bare soil, it could be around poor quality hedgerows, it could be around suboptimal grazing regimes in terms of some specific target species like corncrake or wader or something like that, trying to have that right land management at the season where the birds would be nesting. So acres, it's a big scheme. As I said, it's the flagship scheme. But again, it's the operations. As I say, this is where boots hit the ground and the scale. Everyone has an interest in this, but how do we ensure a fairness of delivery to everyone on the ground? So for acres, we have 8 locally led CP teams. They try and deliver that technical, ecological or water quality support on the ground to farm advisors. We have 840 farm advisors trained in acres. We have 54,000 participants, and it's covering a footprint of about 1.5 million hectares. And of that, there's just over 1 million hectares that's scored. So this is a very significant operation that we're trying to deliver on the ground and to try and get it out there. And overall, this scheme has been very well received by farmers in terms of, I suppose, the overall concept of results-based payment. Our challenge today has been on the payment side, but again, that's straightening itself out and will be very shortly hitting the $500 million mark in terms of spend on acres to date. Coming back to the scorecards, in acres we have 10 different scorecards. They're primarily habitat-based scorecards. And even of those, one of them is peatland. The other 6 are variants of grassland. So whether that's mock air grasslands, just your general grassland that's everywhere, rough grazing, there's quite a number that we have within that space. And then we have 3 target species. So that's the corncrake, the wader bird, and the other one won't come to me, and the chough. So the CP teams provide training to farm advisors to bring them up to speed in terms of the scorecard, how to do it. And today I'm just going to take a look at the scores that have been coming into us on 2 scorecards. The grassland scorecard, which is effectively a low input grassland, and the rough grazing one. And that's making up, I suppose, 280,000 hectares of grassland is covered under that. So I suppose this is the areas. It might be a bit small for the back of the room, but again, you can see the variation of the scorecards and the conservation target that we have on individual ones. So like the breeding waders there, the burn winterage, so we've basically upscaled the burn winterage in terms of what we're doing. So there's now 19,000 hectares of the burn winterage area is being scored through acres, which is hugely significant. The corncrake there, much smaller footprint in terms of what would be on it. Chough, again, small enough area. But the low input grassland here is at that 200,000 odd hectares of low input grassland. And this is only looking at the CP zones. On top of that, you have commonage land scored, over 400,000 hectares, and you have I suppose within acres general, there's been a certain amount of scoring as well that's in excess of 100,000 hectares. In terms of, I suppose, going into it, John went into, I suppose, the species, but we've set up a scorecard. The higher the payment, the higher the score, the higher the payment the farmer receives. So it's trying to infer that quality-based assessment that a farmer sees a value in what's in that. The score is made up of 3 primary sections within the scorecard, from that ecological integrity component around those target species that John mentioned. We're mainly focusing on the herb species that are in it rather than the grasses, and that structural diversity of the sward. Then the hydrological integrity is very important in relation to peatlands and wet grasslands. And then it's on these threats and pressures around the future prospects for survival of that grassland. So that could be encroaching scrub, encroaching bracken, bare soil, and this is trying to put pointers or signposts to the farmer as to what areas that they could try and target to improve that would help pull them up that payment scale and what they receive for the grassland in question. Again, this is just a snapshot of the range of species that are covered. So again, you can see, I think, many of the species that John spoke about. Devil's Bit scabious, self-heal is on it. The composite flowers, again, that John has been mentioning. So I think we've got the kidney vetch there, the knapweed. So again, we're hitting a lot of those target species. And that's where the bulk of the scoring is probably achieved around that in terms of the grassland scorecard. And it's both checking that diversity of what's present and then also the abundance of what's there. So again, when farm advisors go out to score in the field, they have a phone app that brings up the scorecard, and they walk a W pattern through the field. And then depending on the level of occurrence, they're able to make an assessment of low, moderate, high or very high abundance of the species in terms of what's present in the field. Again, that's just pictures that's there. So we'll move on. So when the advisor does that work, it's on a phone app, it's submitted automatically into the system, and there's a map of the plots to be scored. And again, this is all grassland, but you would have that color coded different if there was woodland or peatland in terms of what the farmer would get in terms of, I suppose, the extent of scoring that's present in the field. There's the app. So again, just in terms of quantity, over 800 advisors trained. The only way we'd handle scorecards on that quantum of land, there's 200,000 scorecards. So the only way was through a phone app. So when the summer season comes, the scorecards are pushed out to the app. The advisor is alerted that the scorecards are present on his phone. The advisor arranges with the farmer to score the land and can submit the scores automatically in the field if they want, or they can come back into the office to update it if they need to in terms of before final submission. And also the neat one about the app is the scorecard only becomes live when the farmer is clearly in the field, that there's a geo-reference in the app, that the specific scorecard will only open when the advisor is in the specific field in question to try and ensure the integrity of the scoring that's there. So coming on to the scoring, and again, we've scored land in 23 and 24. So we've just pulled together, I suppose, an overview. It's too early to say that there's any particular trend. So this is a snapshot of all the grasslands that were scored in either 23 or 24. So on the grassland area, there's almost 100,000, is there a pointer on this? Yeah. Almost 100,000 scorecards submitted. And on the rough grazing, 24,000 scorecards. So again, huge volumes of data coming in, huge involvement to the farm advisor in that. And the breakdown here then is between the high scores, so scoring 75 or higher, moderate, low, very low in terms of that scorecard. So you can see the vast majority of scorecards when they're coming in, they're actually in that low, moderate or high. There's only, I suppose, about 10% that are very low that wouldn't get a payment. So I suppose, again, to me, that was quite a good trend. And the objective for farmers then is to come from the low and moderate to try and bring their figures into the high. And the average score that we have then for this, it's actually similar on both the grassland and the rough grazing. It's at 57. The median is 60, so it's quite a good average that's there in terms of that. And if we went to the burn in terms of the scoring, the score is about an average of a 7 or a bit higher than 7. So again, that signifies, I suppose, that diversity that's present in the burn over and above other ones. But again, it's trying to push farmers in that direction, that they're seeing a value of higher scores, higher payments, informing, I suppose, that direction of travel and interest in what they're trying to achieve. That it's not just value of the meat and milk sold off the land, but now there's a value being placed on the diversity of the sward that's present on the farm. So again, this is another breakdown of that grassland scorecard. So it's 224,000 hectares. And again, coming on to that, I suppose, primary management. Grazed, the vast majority of our grasslands are grazed as opposed to meadow. So again, I suppose it signifies, where most people are. That's what, about 20% of the grassland area is under meadow. And then I know the ratings here maybe are hard to read. So again, on the primarily grazed, you can have both overgrazed and undergrazed, and you're trying to get it into the optimum. So we have 75,000 hectares of the 117 is in a good status in terms of that diverse sward structure that's there. And then you have it sort of peeling off to both sides in terms of, I suppose, overgrazed where there's too much stock, or undergrazed where there's not enough. And the advisor's role then is trying to give the farmer advice as to how to get it to that optimum position of maximising the score that's there present on that. And I suppose that's the challenge and the sweetness of the results-based payments. We're not giving a prescription, date-based, calendar-based farmers to the farmer to try and achieve something. We're basically going, this is the quality of the habitat, and it's up to the advisor to engage with the farmer then to try and optimize the management strategy that gets to the better scoring rate in terms of that good sward structure. On the meadow then, it's slightly different score rating, but again, in terms of good, I suppose it's about 30% there that's on good. I think it's 6 here as well. It's similar, and then a smaller amount on the poor. So again, the primary one here is leaving wider field margins on the field to sort of maximize your score in terms of meadowland that's there. And I suppose, to me, probably the biggest challenge on the meadowland is, again, we have, I suppose, climate change. It's harder and harder for farmers to, I suppose, save quality grass. So they are cutting their meadow too early in the year. That's not allowing a chance for the herbs or grasses to seed. And that's probably the biggest thing that needs to be trying to be improved in that area. On the rough grazing, again, this is as you're going further up, I suppose, in altitude, it's rough grazing. I guess the target species we were really thinking about was the hen harrier in the design of this scorecard. And again, most of the rough grazing is primarily grazed. And again, that smaller amount that's under meadow. And again, proportionally, it's less than on the lower down grasslands that you have. And again, on the scoring, quite a lot of it that's in good condition in relation to that rough grazing sward characteristic without being abandoned. And I suppose, again, there's no prescription. It's about getting the right advice to the farmer to ensure that there's active management of this rather than letting the land close over and being scrubbed over. So again, an interesting one then on the, I suppose, devil's bit scabious, and it's the host of the Marsh fritillary butterfly. And one of the questions that we have on the scorecard is around the presence of devil's bit scabious. It's just a presence, absence, and then the height, if it's above a certain height in the field. But both the presence and the height give more or less the same thing. But clearly, the association of devil's bit scabious, it's associated with the higher scoring pastures. The higher scoring fields have devil's bit scabious, which again is good to see in terms of, I suppose, the effectiveness of the scorecard. It is picking up on that in terms of scoring. And again, it's the same for the rough grazing. The higher scoring fields tend to be more associated with the presence of devil's bit scabious. Then moving on to some of the, I suppose, the pressures on grassland. So in the top here, I have immature scrub and its encroachment onto the grassland scorecard. And I suppose overall, people would be concerned about land abandonment, but generally speaking, from the assessments that have been done, most of the scorecards are actually showing a low presence of immature scrub encroachment into the field, which I think is good, because this is one you'd always hear around what is happening regarding the management. Of course, there is a small number of scorecards, 460 scorecards, an area of that have scrub encroachment. And again, it's something to be watched in terms of that management intensity that's there to try and pick it up. And again, it's the same on the bracken. It's a small amount of the grassland fields that are scored have a high presence of bracken encroachment. And again, there's complementary actions then within the acre scheme that supports a farmer to try and better manage that scrub encroachment or the bracken encroachment into the field, again, to try and reduce the level of the pressure and get a higher score then achieved as you move towards the lower status. So overall, I think it's interesting to look at these, and I'm looking at both of these as standalone. There could be overlaps or they could be cumulative in terms of how you look at them. And then on the hedgerow, I suppose field boundaries are also assessed within the grassland scorecard. So it looks at the worst 30 metres of field boundary within the field. And I suppose overall, there's 70% is good or moderate in terms of that field boundary quality, which again, I think is quite good. Again, you'll be hearing a lot of bad news about field boundaries and they're being removed all the time, but the evidence here is showing that it's actually quite reasonable in terms of that field boundary. There's obviously work to be done with the poor, but again, it's moving that right direction. And when you look at the rough grazing, again, the trend quite similar. So even in the rough grazing, the amount of scorecards that are illustrating, I suppose, scrub encroachment or bracken encroachment isn't that high, relatively speaking, of the number of scorecards. But again, that's where, the advisor can recommend these non-productive investments to try and better manage those pressures that are on the scorecard, to try and improve the score, and so the farmer gets a better payment. So I suppose overall then, just coming back, that's been a bit of a snapshot of what we're trying to do in terms of results-based payments and trying to incentivize higher quality habitat or grassland habitats that are on Irish farms. Overall, there's no prescription in it. It's based on farm advice or farmers doing what they're already doing. So if a farmer has high quality grasslands, they're paid more than their neighbour that might have poorer quality grasslands to try and create that market incentive within what's there. So obviously farmers then have greater freedom to farm as they want, not to be looking at the calendar, and this has been one of the selling points of the various locally led schemes that we're trying to do. Because there's less prescription, it means there's less risk of penalty on the farmer as well, because they're managing the land as they've always done, and they're only engaging with complementary actions if they wish to take them on, in terms of what's there. And overall, it's that payment for a higher quality and trying to get that signal out to the market that there is a value in a sort of reducing that management intensity of grasslands to try and have greater biodiversity outcomes in terms of where we are. Like overall acres, it's an enormous scheme to try and roll out. That split between grasslands, so like we've looked at the main grassland scorecards, but the rough split in the million hectares that's scored is 400,000 hectares of grassland, 600,000 hectares of peatland scorecard. So again, the peatland one does something quite similar in that regard as well. So I think that's it from me. So hopefully that's an improved buy-in then by everyone in terms of what we're trying to achieve with grasslands on Irish farms.
That's super. Thanks, Mil, for stopping it on. So Helen, you can maybe start sharing your presentation, and Pat, maybe just when we're waiting for Helen to share a presentation, this is really a success story. I just looked at the numbers of advisors alone that were trained, and we know there's a big knowledge gap there in this kind of knowledge transfer. It is a success story to get that training was carried out, and it's actively going out on the ground on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, look, I suppose that's the one thing that the feedback we're getting from advisors is they're really enjoying getting out into the fields, onto the farms, getting out of the office. And look, we've been lucky with this cooperation project teams. They've been on the ground in the local areas providing training to both farmers and advisors. So every year, any advisor who wants to score the land, they have to do the mandatory scorecard training before they go out and do the scoring. And look, I think that's a big part of this. You know, it is new to a lot of people. It's new to farmers, new to advisors. It's new to us in the department as well, upscaling. So that continual upskilling and training is a huge part of it.
That's super. Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Helen. That's up and good to go. So we'll let you off. Thanks a million.
Great. Thanks very much, Cathal, and thanks for the invitation to speak here this morning about extensive grassland types that occur within Ireland. I suppose just as I start off, just to consider maybe the wider agricultural landscape for a moment. And of course, a key output of our agricultural systems is food production, and that is the case and should be the case. However, we also need our landscapes to, I suppose, facilitate the delivery of a whole range of other ecosystem services. So things like nutrient cycling, regulation of pests and diseases, and so on. And the delivery of those ecosystem services is often largely dependent on retention of biodiversity within our landscapes. So I suppose when we consider how we produce our food, that can have significant impacts on how well the surrounding landscape can also deliver these wider range of ecosystem services. And also then in return, I suppose, you know, the ability of the landscape to deliver those services will impact on our capacity to be able to continue to produce, you know, food over time. So we have a legal and a moral obligation to protect and maintain biodiversity in our landscape. But even if we take just a very human-centric view of why we should maintain it, I think this piece is hugely important. You know, it is key to the sustainability of our food production systems and will continue to be. So obviously in a landscape like Ireland, much of it is dominated by grasslands, and the National Land Cover Map concluded that about 55% of the national area is under grassland of one type or another. So therefore it stands to reason that our grasslands are going to have a significant impact on our biodiversity. I'm going to give an overview, a very quick whistle-stop tour of some of the more extensively managed and often referred to as semi-natural grasslands that occur within the country. But it's important to note at this stage that we don't actually have natural grasslands here, unlike other parts of the world, like the steppes in Russia, for example, or the prairies in North America. Our climax vegetation is woodlands, so the development and maintenance of our grassland has largely gone hand in hand with the development of our agricultural systems and, you know, reflects the intensity of our land use management over the last 6,000 years or so. Before I moved on to the extensive grassland, I just want to consider for a moment or reflect for a moment on our improved grassland types. So again, the National Land Cover Map produced by Taoiseach and the EPA has concluded that about 42% of the national area consists of this type of improved grassland. Now, that's a kind of a catch-all term, if you like. And on one side of it, I would see the intensive grasslands, which are largely comprised of monocultures or maybe ryegrass and white clover, tend to be heavily stocked and so on. On the other hand, we do have improved grasslands that would have significantly more biodiversity associated with them. They wouldn't necessarily be flower or herb rich, for example, but they may have undergone some improvement in the past and maybe in receipt of some degree of slurry, but would tend to get a very limited amount of artificial fertilizer. And therefore we see a diversity of grass species in them in particular. And this is hugely important because it provides, I suppose, greater architectural complexity of the sward, and therefore facilitates potentially the ability of these swards to support a wider range of associated biodiversity. However, just moving on then to the more extensive grasslands, and if we consider what actually influences the botanical composition of our grasslands, I guess there's two bunches of factors I define them as, and one are the kind of the natural or environmental factors, which we can't do a whole lot about, like the climatic conditions in a particular geographic location, the geology and soil type and so on. And then we have the human-induced management factors, so the things that we do to generally with a view to increasing the agronomic potential of these grasslands. So reseeding, use of inputs like fertilizers, herbicides and so on, and addition of lime. So the influence of those human-induced management factors has increased very significantly over the last 50, 60 years, not just in Ireland, but throughout the world. Many areas of the world have seen that kind of increase in intensity of the human management factors. So the first group of extensively managed grasslands that I'll touch on are the species-rich calcareous ones, and these are flower-rich ones. Generally speaking, the most abundant or widespread area of these grasslands would certainly be in the Burren in County Clare, where it is not unusual to put down a metre square quadrat and, end up with 25, 30 species recorded within that. However, outside of areas like the Burren, they really only exist in small pockets, perhaps in areas like Esker Ridges, for example, and other small pockets on farms. When we think about areas like the Burren, of course, they're really special and, are a home to a wide range of our orchid species, but also the weird but wonderful combination of Arctic alpine species, such as spring gentian, which grow side by side with species that would be more likely to be found in Mediterranean conditions, so species like bloody cranesbill. And we don't see that combination of species occurring really elsewhere in the country, which makes these grasslands found there really, really special. Moving on to our mock-air grasslands, these are coastal grasslands that have a very restricted range globally, really only occurring on the northwest coast of Ireland, so from about Galway Bay up to Donegal, and on the northwest coast of Scotland. And they're flatter, slightly undulating grasslands that occur on the landward side of some of our sand dune systems. So they've really formed as a consequence of sand and shell blow inland and grasses forming on those. So they tend to be highly calcareous as well. These areas, there's certainly been some very significant work done on them in terms of supporting landowners now to manage and ensure that they're kept in good ecological condition through the EU Life on Mock-air funded Life on Mock-air project. I was lucky enough last May, I think it was, to visit Belmullet with Catherine Keena to a farmer discussion group down there that was hosted by Tom Kelly. And it was a wonderful opportunity to actually listen to farmers and appreciate how important they felt the mock-air was in terms of their particular systems and the role that it played, the integral role it played in their systems, in some cases negating the need for winter housing and so on. And the understanding that, if it was managed well, it would continue to play a really important part in their agricultural system. In terms of the wet and seasonally flooded grasslands, I guess we often think of these as being dominated by rush species. However, if you see some of these in early May, for example, is probably the best time, where you will get to see a profusion of species such as ragged robin and cuckoo flower and marsh pea, for example. And of course, really good examples of that kind of wet grassland are to be found along the Callows. But they're also found in other pockets on farms where, you have low-lying topography and a high water table. And of course, these grasslands are very important in terms of the botanical species they support, but also the wider biodiversity that they support. Not least of which are the breeding waders, and the breeding wader EIP is now working with landowners in these areas where they're, to try and help maintain and restore populations of some of our most endangered breeding waders. And of course, maintenance and management of our wet grassland is key to that. Our acid grasslands are often associated with upland areas, and they often merge into habitats like dense bracken, heathland habitats and blanket bogs. They're definitely not as showy from a flower perspective as the calcareous grasslands that I mentioned earlier. However, they still have a range of species that are adapted to live in acidic areas of low nutrient status. Of course, they can also occur and do occur in lowland areas. And some of them are really special because they're also what we would call wax cap grasslands. And this means that they have a variety of wax caps or fungi that occur within these grasslands, which is really reflecting the more biologically diverse state of the soil in these areas. Then we have the lowland hay meadows, which once would have been abundant throughout the country. And these are typified probably by early, spring grazing and then not mowing until late in the summer. And this gives the variety of grassland and flower species, which could include things like oxeye daisy and tufted vetch and so on. It allows those to flower and set seed, and therefore ensure their continued diversity into the future. Unfortunately, these, as with many of our other extensively managed grassland types or semi-natural grassland types, are afforded protection under the EU Habitats Directive because of the loss of area of these grassland types over recent decades. I want to just consider for a minute some of the more common habitats that have been retained on our farms throughout the country, and these may include small patches of semi-natural grassland that can be found in our field margins, along our roadway margins, farm roadway margins, and so on. And these areas, while they may not be supporting rare or threatened species or species that have, I suppose, have gained the attention of international protection, there may be species that have been regarded as quite common today, but certainly less common than they used to be. And therefore, we need to ensure that we maintain these habitats in as good an ecological condition as possible, and also ensure their continued existence, because they are undoubtedly hugely important to maintaining biodiversity on our farmland and ensuring that those ecosystem services that I mentioned at the outset continue to be delivered. Just considering where we are with farmland habitat types, I guess some of the work that we undertook as part of the Agri-Baseline project, which was funded by the Department of Agriculture, showed that on average over 118 farms in different parts of the country, we found that about 13% of farm area was managed under semi-natural habitat types. And then we had the marginally productive habitats, which would also include some of the semi-natural grasslands. So it doesn't give us a figure for semi-natural grassland area, but it does give us an insight into the kind of areas of habitats that have been retained on farms in a broader sense. And we can see from this that this, while at the outset it looks good, and it is good, it does vary significantly based on region, but also farming system. And obviously the land use intensity is going to significantly impact that. So the key challenges for our extensive grasslands have been summarised very nicely in the surveys undertaken by the National Parks and Wildlife Services. So they undertook two different surveys, one between 2007 and 2012 and the other between 2015 and 2017. And in the intervening time period, based on a subsample of the original group, they found that approximately 30 and 28% respectively of the calcareous and hay meadow site areas had been lost over that time period. And they identified the key threats to those habitats at the time as being obviously intensification, which we understand is a key threat, but also abandonment. And John mentioned this in his presentation, that idea that these areas will scrub over time if they are not managed under grazing or cutting conditions. And then, of course, changes to different land uses, whether that be forestry, for example, will result in the loss of some of these grassland areas. So to summarise in terms of the key messages around the management of these areas, we need to ensure that we maintain the current extensive grasslands that we have within the country, to enhance their ecological integrity and to expand the area of these where possible. In terms of the little pockets that are retained on farms, while these may be small, they're still hugely important, and fragment size and shape is really important, with longer, narrower fragments being more prone to removal over time. And also we should keep in mind that proximity and connectivity to similar habitat types is hugely important for the movement of species in our landscapes. I suppose the key message is, though, that we certainly need to keep farming these areas. Fencing them off and walking away from them is not a solution for maintaining extensive and semi-natural grasslands. We need to keep farming them. They need to be cut or grazed. But it's the intensity at which this is done is important. And of course, in terms of maintaining them, avoiding things like reseeding, management practices such as reseeding, the inputs of fertiliser, slurry or pesticides, or indeed lime is hugely important, as is drainage and the use of ring feeders. And I mentioned ring feeders because, in terms of managing these grasslands, they really need to be stocked at their natural carrying capacity. So we cannot be bringing in additional feed into them, because that causes more challenges and difficulties in terms of maintaining them over time. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a million, Helen. That was excellent. And we're going to get into questions in a minute, but I have one quick question for you, and I like the way you finished, because and it ties in with the question I asked Pat about training. I'd say for a long, long time, a lot of people thought if you close the gate on the field and let it go, that was great for biodiversity and species biodiversity, but that's obviously very much not the case.
No, I mean, our grasslands, as I said at the outset, have really developed in tandem with our agricultural systems. But we know, these special pockets of semi-natural, extensively managed grasslands need that continuation in management. If we walk away, they will scrub over, whether it's bracken encroachment, then moving on to gorse and so on. And once they're gone, they're gone. So walking away is certainly not the answer to their management if we value the biodiversity those grasslands support.
Yeah, super. I won't delay too long, Catherine, because I know there's plenty of questions coming in, so I'll head over to you there now so we get as many done as we can.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Cathal. So just first one slightly on, probably from the acres point of view, about hedges. So I'll just deal with it quickly. Hedges planted, never cut. So hedges are about 3 to 4 metres high and about 2 metres wide. So to me, they're absolutely super and belong into the category of tree line hedges. and we'll be hearing a lot about this at the end of the month, Cathal, with Hedgerow Week, where we're aiming for 50% of hedges on all farms to be tree line hedges, never topped. So that would fit into that. Alternatively, that one could be laid in a future time to turn it into a topped hedge. So we want both types of hedges, but that one I would be inclined to leave that alone. And just from the acres point of view, and I know, Pat, that the only point there is you don't cut hedges below 1.8 meters. So just to be careful on that one. So perhaps I'll go on to another one for Pat, and if you want to come back on the hedges, but can I confirm the results-based payment is from the initial assessment? So tell us about when and who it's reassessed by, Pat, for the scoring of the grassland.
Yeah, so results based on acres. I suppose some farmers will be selected for an inspection. We do pick inspections and risk analysis. So for farmers who are not inspected, it's the advisor score the payment is based on. If you're one of the farmers who've been selected for inspection, we will go out after the advisor scores the land, and it's on the inspector score the farmer is paid. So I suppose the key message here is just because the advisor has scored your land on a specific date doesn't give you the freedom to manage it. Well, you have the freedom to manage it as you want, but any damaging activities that occur after that will be picked up in an inspection, and the payment will be based on the inspector's.
But tell us,
assessment.
Pat, about how often the advisors go back to reassess.
For everybody in acres, it was mandatory to score in year one. Okay, after year one, it's mandatory to score at least every second year. So you could opt not to score in year two, and by doing that, what you're doing is you're declaring your one score for your year two payment. Or you can voluntarily opt to rescore in year two if you think your land has improved and you'll get an improved score. So if you don't score in year two, then you have to score in year three, and that's how it carries on, at least every second year after year one.
So everybody in acres will be scored 3 times over their contract.
Exactly. Yeah.
And paid accordingly. And the question then was, is there any trend on improving? But I presume that's too soon to we wouldn't expect a trend yet, Pat.
No, it'd be too early. And look, from individual farms, or individual fields, like we expect to see significant improvements where farmers have taken corrective action. So, for example, like if there was invasive species bringing down a score, and if the farmer undertakes an action to remove those invasive species, that could have lead to significant improvement in the score within that field. But as a whole across the country, like the improvements will probably be incremental, because not every farmer will be willing to take on the necessary action to improve the scores. So we expect it'll depend from farm to farm how.
Very good. Yeah, thanks. And Helen, I'm going to ask you to comment too on the nettles and thistles. Now, I would make a distinction between thistles being a noxious weed and nettles are not. But the question anyway is that we know these are native species and they are vital to butterfly life. Here was the example. So the question is about them being negatively scored for acres,
And I suppose it's a very fair point. They are native, they are important for biodiversity, and there's no problem, I think, in a small amount of them being present. The problem is when they're overly abundant, which is generally then reflecting a higher nutrient value of the soils. So that's where they become abundant within fields, and that's the kind of challenge with them. So I suppose small amounts are fine, but when you have a high abundance of them, they're reflecting management practices that are not conducive to having species-rich or ecologically important grasslands.
So we don't want fields of those from a biodiversity point of view, even. Sure, we don't.
No. Having that diversity of species is much more important. Yeah.
Pat,
maybe if I could just add there, sorry,
yeah.
Katrin.
Yeah.
Like in our grassland scorecard, marsh and meadow thistle are actually positive species.
Mhm.
Okay, it's the creeping and spear thistle are negative, and the nettles. And as Helen said, if there's only a small occurrence of them, there will be no negative marks. It's where they become more abundant, the negative marks come into play.
Optimum stocking rates for grazing these grasslands. I suppose this is where the results based, we don't need to know them, but Pat, do you have a comment on optimum stocking rates?
Look, really, there is no common figure you could, it depends on obviously the soil type and the
Yeah.
part of the country you're
And
in.
the results base takes away that need for that, isn't that right? The results based score, it's up to the farmer to figure out, what works.
Exactly. So look, obviously overgrazing isn't good. Undergrazing, depending on the scorecard, obviously there's a bit of variance, and poaching. So like the key thing is to look at the scorecard and farm according to what will get you the best results and the best payment.
Helen, any comment from your experience on stocking rates apart from acres?
No, I mean, I guess as Pat says, hugely important to think about the geology and the topography and so on in a particular area, and whether it's a wet grassland versus a dry grassland is going to be huge. I suppose just to acknowledge there that the management, keeping it in a good ecological condition, is something that I suppose people have learned over generations, and it's trying to maintain that knowledge over time and into the future is hugely important to their retention. But also, I suppose, the avoidance of bringing in supplementary feeding into these areas is important, because that is something that indicates that we are not managing the grasslands within their natural carrying capacity. If we have to bring in additional feeding there, and that's going to give rise to ring feeders and dunging around those, and then I suppose nettles and thistles and so on proliferating in those areas. So that's what I would say on that.
And just Helen, while you're talking about from your experience, there was a question last week about the value of the grasses that John was talking about, and where any of that research is, like the value of the old traditional grasses.
Yeah.
Can you comment?
Yeah, well, I mean, if we look back at the kind of the history of that research, and certainly things like the Clifton Park system of farming and so on, people were looking at grassland mixtures at that time, which were going back to the early 20th century there, and they understood how species worked together, I suppose, at that time. We largely forgot about that body of research with the widespread availability of fairly, I suppose, value for money in terms of our fertilizer, so relatively cheap fertilizer inputs, and a focus very much on using that to promote growth. But now we're in a different space where we're thinking about, well, how can we reduce those inputs, those costly inputs that are both costly from an economic perspective, but also from an environmental perspective. And I suppose looking at biodiversity again as a source of species that can help us to maintain agricultural output. I mean, in this instance, I suppose what we're talking about are the multi-species sword research that's ongoing, where we're trying to build a little more diversity back into swords again. They wouldn't fall under the heading of these kind of extensive grasslands that I'm talking about today, because they're largely just comprised of maybe a small handful, 6, 7 species, for example, of grasses, legumes and forage herbs. But the idea is similar to that work that was ongoing at the turn of the last century, the turn of the 20th century, I should say, where, it was growing those species in combination to try and increase and enhance productivity of the grasslands. But they are not extensively or semi-natural grasslands. The species we're putting in, the varieties of those have been agronomically bred for their potential to produce.
Yeah,
Much of that research kind of stems from that. So obviously there's a lot of work ongoing at the moment in that space.
Very good, very good. Pat, a question for you. Originally, there were skeptics to acres, where some perceived the scheme as paying farmers to abandon land or walk away from productive agriculture. Now we're 3 years down the road. Do you think this perception has changed? And or is there more dedicated work need to educate? Is there still more need for education? How are we doing?
Yeah, well, look, there's always more need for education. You're never finished with informing farmers, informing the public of what is best and I suppose what we're doing within acres. Look, it's fairly clear from the scorecards if you look at them. If you abandon your land, you will not get a good score and you will not get a good payment. So it's not encouraging land abandonment. It's encouraging good land management. And that, I suppose, how you manage your land is completely up to the farmer. But the advice is going to be there through your advisor and through the cooperation project teams. We have an awful lot of information on our website. We're in the process of bringing out some informational videos as well. All the CP teams, they have huge resources on their websites. And I suppose it's about getting that across to not every farmer is IT savvy, we know that. But there's an awful lot of information meetings as well that are going on in local areas through the advisors and through the CP teams. Every farmer in acres has to do mandatory acres training. And the idea of that training is to upskill farmers so they learn what the scheme is about and they can learn how best they can do out of the scheme as well financially and to draw down money. And it's win-win for everyone, I think, if farmers become more, I suppose, informed, and we are making better efforts definitely in that.
Just off the back of that, Helen, there's a number of questions around the amount of research in the area of managing the semi-natural grasslands. And based on what Pat just said there's a lot of training gone out. But going back to something you did in your presentation where you're looking at the burn versus, a hay meadow, is there some sites, or is it very site specific in the type of management? And are we to that stage of training our advisors and our farmers, I suppose, educating them? It's tricky enough, I'd say, isn't it? It's not a blanket approach for knowledge transfer.
No, it's not a blanket approach, but at the same time, it does come down to most of those factors that I had on my last slide there. It is about continuation of farming in these areas, but it's ensuring that, your stocking rates, your stocking intensity fall within the natural carrying capacity of the land. And that means, in my head, stocking rates that aren't causing undergrazing, overgrazing, poaching, and so on. So what the land can naturally kind of take without causing any damage to it. And that will be quite site specific, but I guess, that's where farmer knowledge also comes to play because, these areas were managed and have been managed by farmers for a very long time, and they know where changes have been made over time themselves or are likely to know. And then it comes down to things like keeping the inputs out of these grasslands. And I suppose just appreciating that while, we might talk about what one should be doing in terms of nutrient inputs or lime inputs and so on, that kind of recommendation is not appropriate for these extensively managed grasslands. So keeping those inputs out, keeping the farming ongoing on them are the two key messages, I think.
Yeah, and Catherine, that's a big bugbear of yours, that we get the correct message for the correct type of land that's in front of us.
And again, we don't want to turn that around to say, and I see there was a comment there about we were told to spread lime and now we're told not to. There is no change. It's field specific. But yes, it depends what do you want from the field?
Yeah.
And does it need it? Yeah.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time this morning, but thank you to everybody that did submit questions. And I think fair play to you, Catherine, you've got through most of them there anyway. And I know we had a kind of a rushed agenda today, but I think it was really good and really insightful. I just want to thanks a million to Professor Helen Sheridan and John Muldowney for excellent presentations this morning. And also thanks to Pat Morrisson and Dr. Catherine Keena for joining us to help with questions also. And a big thanks to Yvonne Maher in the background there that helps running the show and keeps everything smooth. And just to let you know that next week we can look forward to chatting to Teagasc crop specialist Shay Phelan to discuss integrated pest management in Ireland, where, when and how. So that's not to be missed. So do tune in again next Friday at 9:30. Slán go fóill.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson and thanks for listening.